Melsbroek Airfield, northeast of Brussels, September 3, 1944. Early afternoon, the light flat and grey over the Belgian plain. A Focke Wulfs FW-190 rolls out onto the grass, with 4 others behind it. The man in the lead aircraft is Captain Emil Lang, commander of the second group of Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the most decorated fighter pilots alive. He has been credited with 173 aerial victories. On a single day over the Dnieper, the previous autumn, he was credited with 18 of them, which is the highest single-day tally of credited victories recorded for any fighter pilot of any nation. He is not going into combat. He is moving his group eastward, away from the collapsing front in France, to a field further inside German-held territory, an administrative flight. The kind of movement that in any previous year of this war would have been the safest hour in a fighter pilot's week. The aircraft lifts off. Lang selects gear up, and the undercarriage does not retract. It hangs fully extended beneath him, 2 long legs and 2 wheels turning slowly in the slipstream, adding drag, holding his speed down, pinning him to the bottom of the sky. He does not turn back. He climbs slowly with his wingman and his second element, and about 10 minutes later he is still at only around 200 meters above the fields near Overhespen, gear down, slow, low, and heavy. He has done nothing wrong. He is over friendly territory. He is inside the operating radius of his own airfield, in airspace that his own command still considered its own. There is no bomber stream overhead. There is no raid warning. There is no target within 100 kilometers worth an enemy fighter's fuel. And then his aircraft is burning. It goes into the ground near Overhespen, and Lang is killed instantly. The most successful active fighter leader in the West dies 10 minutes after takeoff, on a routine transfer flight, having never reached fighting altitude and having never fired his guns. The surviving pilots of his flight could not agree on what had killed him. His wingman and his second element reported that they had been attacked by thunderbolts. American records credit the victory to First Lieutenant Darrell Kramer of the 338th Fighter Squadron, part of the 55th Fighter Group, which had converted from Lightnings to Mustangs that July. Kramer was flying a P-51, not a Thunderbolt. A Royal Air Force pilot, Flight Lieutenant Terence Spencer of No. 41 Squadron, also claimed a Focke Wulfs shot down in that area that afternoon. Donald Caldwell, who wrote the operational history of Jagdgeschwader 26, favors Kramer. The dispute has never been resolved, and probably never will be. But notice what nobody disputes: that Lang was low, that his gear was down, that he was minutes from his own runway, on his own side of the line, in an aircraft not configured to fight, and a formation not expecting to, and that his own pilots did not see the attackers until the attack was already happening. That is the part that should not have been possible. A fighter pilot of Lang's experience did not die that way. He died in a turning fight at altitude, or to a bomber's gunner, or to flak over a target. He did not die in his own landing pattern, 10 minutes from his own field, on a transfer flight, killed by an enemy who by every pre-war and early war assumption of European air warfare should not have been able to reach that piece of sky at all. And the German records of that summer show that this was not an unlucky exception. It had become the normal way to die. German operational reporting from 1944 contains a complaint that reads, strangely coming from an air force. It is not a complaint about being outnumbered, though the Luftwaffe was outnumbered. It is not a complaint about inferior aircraft, and the German fighter pilots of that year did not believe their aircraft were inferior. The complaint is that enemy fighters were carrying out attacks on aircraft that were landing, and on the airfields themselves. Read that as an operational statement rather than a grievance. A fighter force is reporting to its own high command that the airspace directly above its own bases is no longer usable, not contested, not dangerous, unusable. The same theme appears in sources with no connection to each other, in the reports of individual fighter wings across northern Germany, in the recollections of surviving pilots who never served together, and, after the war, in the interrogations of the men who ran the whole system. General Karl Koller, who ended the war as chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, told his Allied interrogators that the arrival of long-range American fighter cover over Germany came as something new and fatal. He was precise about why. He had calculated that if his fighters could inflict losses of around 30% on unescorted American bomber formations, the daylight offensive would have to stop. He never got to test that arithmetic a second time. A complaint that recurs identically across units with no shared chain of command is no longer an anecdote. It is a measurement. Something had happened to the structure of the air war, and the men living inside it could describe the effect precisely while being unable to name the cause. Now hold that image of a German fighter force that cannot protect its own runways, and set beside it what the same air defense system, run by the same officers, using the same radar network and the same ground control procedures, had been doing only months earlier. On the night of March 30, 1944, Royal Air Force Bomber Command sent 795 aircraft to Nuremberg, 572 Lancasters, 214 Halifaxes, and 9 Mosquitoes. The German controllers ignored the diversionary raids designed to pull them away and massed their night fighters at 2 radio beacons sitting almost exactly astride the bomber route. 95 aircraft did not come home, 11.9% of the force in a single night, the worst in the history of Bomber Command. Around 79 were destroyed by night fighters. 82 of the 95 fell on the way in or near the target, and the slaughter tailed off on the return leg only because the German fighters had to go home and refuel. That was not an accident either. It was the last operation of a 5-month campaign against Berlin in which the German night defences had inflicted losses the British could not sustain. The campaign ended without breaking Germany, and Bomber Command was in any case about to be redirected onto targets in France in preparation for the invasion. So the same system that in March could not be broken by the largest night bombing force in the world was, by September, unable to keep a single transfer flight alive for 10 minutes over its own airfield. Nothing had been taken away from it. The radar was still there. The control rooms were still there. The aircraft were still coming off the production lines in greater numbers than ever before in the war, and yet it had stopped working. So what changed? The obvious answers are all wrong, and they are worth killing early, because most accounts lean on at least one of them. The first is that the Americans simply built a better fighter. They did build an outstanding one, but the Mustang was not decisively superior to a well-flown FW-190 or a late Model B F-109, and German pilots who survived 1944 said so consistently. The second is that the bombing destroyed the German aircraft industry. It did not. German aircraft production rose through 1944 and reached its wartime peak in that year, and there were more fighters available to the Luftwaffe in the autumn than there had been in the spring. The third is that the Germans ran out of aircrew because they were outnumbered. Outnumbered forces have held air defense campaigns before and since. Numbers alone do not produce a collapse this abrupt. The real answer does not begin in a cockpit and does not begin in Germany. It begins in offices in Washington, in a workshop at an English aero engine factory, in a paper mill in London, and finally in one American commanding general's first week in a new job in January 1944. None of those people were trying to defeat the German air defense network. Between them, they produced something no air force had attempted before, which was a way of destroying an enemy air force that did not require beating it over the target at all. To understand why that mattered, you have to take the German system seriously, because it was the most sophisticated air defense network that had ever existed, and almost everything built since owes something to it. It began in July 1940, when Colonel Joseph Kammhuber was given the job of stopping British night bombers. Kammhuber did not approach this as a pilot. He approached it as an engineer, laying out a production line. He divided the airspace of occupied Europe into a chain of control boxes running from Denmark down through the Low Countries into northern France. The British called it the Kammhuber Line. The Germans called each box a Himmelbett, a 4-poster bed, because the bomber was to be tucked into it. Each box covered roughly 32 kilometers by 20 kilometers. Inside it sat one Freya early warning radar, with a detection range of about 100 kilometers, and 2 Würzburg tracking radars. One Würzburg locked onto the incoming bomber, the other locked onto the German night fighter. Both tracks were plotted onto a single illuminated table, and a ground controller called a Jägerleitoffizier talked the fighter onto the bomber by voice, correcting the intercept second by second until the German pilot could see the exhaust flames ahead of him. Later, the fighters carried their own airborne radar, the Liechtenstein set, and the final closure no longer required moonlight. It worked so well that the Royal Air Force had to invent its way out of it twice. The first escape was the bomber stream, first used on the 1,000 bomber raid against Cologne on the night of May 30, 1942. Instead of trickling across the coast, the bombers went through in a dense column, saturating each box faster than a single fighter could be cycled through it. The second was window, the strips of aluminized paper first dropped over Hamburg in July 1943, which filled every Würzburg screen with false returns and blinded the precision half of the system in a night. Most air defense organizations would have been destroyed by that. The Luftwaffe rebuilt around it in weeks. If the controllers could no longer track individual aircraft, they would stop trying. Under Zahme Sau, Tame Boar, they used the crude general picture that still worked to feed whole night fighter units into the bomber stream and let them hunt inside it. Under Wild Boar, single-engined day fighters were flown at night over the target itself, using the fires and the searchlights as illumination. Neither was elegant. Both worked, and the Nuremberg night was the proof. The daylight organization was even more impressive. Long-range early warning radar on the North Sea coast picked up American formations while they were still assembling over England. Behind that coastal chain sat a broad belt of tracking radars, and behind those the Ground Observer Service, feeding sightings by telephone. All of it converged on a single room in each fighter division headquarters, where the whole raid was projected onto a large vertical glass situation map. Officers behind it wrote the plot in reverse, so the commander could read it directly. From that room, the divisional commander did something that no other air force of that period could do reliably. He did not scramble the nearest squadron. He assembled a force. Using the ground control system known as Y-Control, he could gather fighter units from several bases at a radio beacon, form them into a single mass, and place that mass across the path of the bomber stream at a chosen point, at a chosen altitude, with the sun where he wanted it. He could hold that force until the American escort fighters had reached the limit of their fuel and turned back, and then commit it against bombers that no longer had anyone with them. The weapons he committed were purpose-built for that one job. Twin-engine destroyers, the Bf-110 and the Me-410, carried Werfer Granate 21 rocket tubes under their wings and fired them into the bomber boxes from beyond the range of the defensive machine guns, not primarily to shoot bombers down, but to blow the formation apart so that single-engined fighters could get at stragglers. And from late 1943 there was the Sturmgruppe. The concept belonged to Major Hans Günther von Kornatzky, and Adolf Galland approved it in October 1943. Von Kornatzky reasoned that if bombers could only be brought down by fire, delivered from very close range astern, the answer was an aircraft that could survive flying into that fire. The result was the FW-190A8, fitted with armor glass beside the cockpit, steel plate around the pilot, and two 30mm Mk108 cannon in the outer wings, at a cost of roughly 200 kilograms of extra weight. The pilots called it the Sturmbock, the battering ram. Its cannon fired a shell heavy enough to take the wing off a B-17 with a handful of hits, though each gun carried only about 55 rounds, giving roughly 5 seconds of firing time. On July 7, 1944, the assault groups and their escorts caught the American bomber formations heading for Leipzig. Estimates vary, but somewhere between roughly 28 and 34 heavy bombers were shot down in that action. One American group, the 492nd, lost 12 liberators in about 13 minutes near Bernburg. This was not a backward air force. This was the most technically advanced integrated air defense system on Earth, and in 1944 it was still capable of inflicting a massacre on any formation it could reach on its own terms. If this is the kind of history you want, the engineering and the doctrine underneath the events rather than the highlight reel, then subscribing and leaving a like genuinely helps this channel reach more people who want the same thing. The American bomber force that flew into that system in 1943 did so carrying a theory of its own, and that theory was not stupid. It was the product of about a decade of serious professional thought at the Air Corps Tactical School in Alabama, and it had been written into American war planning in the document known as AWPD-1 in August 1941. The argument ran like this: a modern industrial economy is a web, and the web has load-bearing nodes, ball bearings, synthetic oil, aircraft engines. Destroy a small number of those nodes precisely, and the whole structure fails, without the need to fight through the enemy army at all. Precision required daylight. Daylight required survivability, and survivability, the theory held, could be built into the bomber itself. A B-17 carried up to 13 heavy machine guns. Fly the bombers in a tight combat box. Stack the boxes so that every approach is covered by overlapping fire from dozens of aircraft, and the formation becomes its own escort. American planners were not alone in believing something like this. What made the American version distinctive was how completely it was committed to. Long-range escort fighters were not merely deprioritized. Senior officers within the American Air Arm had spent the pre-war years arguing that a fighter with the range to escort a bomber to Germany was close to a technical impossibility, and pre-war American doctrine placed very little value on external fuel tanks for fighters. Then the theory met the Kammhuber system's daylight equivalent. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force flew its most ambitious operation to date, a double strike against the ball-bearing works at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg. 376 bombers were dispatched. 60 did not return, a loss rate close to 16%, and more than 600 airmen were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner in a single afternoon. The Regensburg force could not face the return trip and flew on to North Africa instead. On September 6, 1943, over Stuttgart, 45 bombers were lost out of the 262 that attacked. And then October 14, 1943, Schweinfurt again. The men who flew it called it Black Thursday. 291 B-17s set out. 60 were shot down, 17 more were written off after landing. 121 came back damaged. That is a loss and damage figure of over 26% of the entire force in one mission. 650 men were lost out of around 2,900 who took off. The official United States Army Air Force's history does not soften it. It records that the 8th Air Force had, for the time being, lost air superiority over Germany. Deep penetration raids into Germany were suspended for months. Now sit with the arithmetic a bomber crewman was doing that autumn. A combat tour was 25 missions. According to the National Museum of the United States Air Force, only about a quarter of 8th Air Force bomber crewmen completed those 25 missions during 1943. The other 3/4 were killed, wounded, or captured. The average life expectancy of a crewman has often been estimated at around 11 missions, though that particular figure is a widely repeated estimate rather than a firmly documented statistic. Every man on every base in East Anglia could work out that the odds were against him surviving his own tour. He watched the empty bunks made up for new arrivals. None of this was a failure of courage or of competence. The crews flew the missions. The formations held. The bombing, when it got through, was reasonably accurate by the standards of the day. What failed was an assumption, and the assumption was that defensive firepower could substitute for air superiority. The Germans had built a system whose entire purpose was to concentrate more attackers against a formation than that formation's guns could suppress, and to do it at a place and time of German choosing. The combat box was a fixed fortification in a medium where nothing is fixed. The Germans could always bring more. There was a second, subtler failure inside the first, and it was about geography rather than firepower. The 8th Air Force did have escort fighters in 1943. Thunderbolts and Lightnings flew with the bombers on every deep mission. The problem was where they had to leave. A thunderbolt of that autumn, even with a belly tank, could accompany a formation only a few hundred miles into occupied Europe before it had to turn back. Schweinfurt was well beyond that. Berlin was far beyond it. So every deep mission had the same shape. The escorts turned for home at a predictable point, waggling their wings at the bombers, and the German controllers, who could see the whole picture on the situation map, committed their assembled fighter mass into the gap. The Germans did not have to beat the American escorts. They only had to outweight them. Bomber crews came to describe the moment the little friends turned back as the loneliest few seconds in the sky, and the German attack usually began within minutes of it. There is one engagement from this period that almost every account of the air war includes, and it is worth telling precisely because the conventional reading of it points in exactly the wrong direction. January 11, 1944. The 8th Air Force went for the aircraft factories at Oschersleben, Halberstadt and Brunswick. The weather closed in behind the leading formations, and much of the escort was recalled. The bombers of the leading combat wing went on to the target with almost nothing over them, and the German controllers put a very large fighter force into the air against them. Into that gap came Major James Howard of the 356th Fighter Squadron, part of the 354th Fighter Group, flying a P-51. Howard, who had flown with the American Volunteer Group in China before the United States entered the war, found himself the only escort pilot in position over a formation of the 401st Bomb Group. He attacked alone and kept attacking for roughly half an hour, breaking up successive passes by German fighters, continuing after most of his guns had stopped working. Bomber crews watching from below reported the action in terms so improbable that the claim was investigated carefully. Howard was awarded the Medal of Honor, the only United States Army Air Force's fighter pilot to receive it for action in the European theater. The way that story is usually told, it is a story about one exceptional man. It was. But the operationally important fact is not Howard's courage. It is that Howard was alone. He was alone because American escort doctrine at the start of 1944 still tied fighters to the bomber formation, and because the number of aircraft that could physically reach Oschersleben and remain there was tiny, and because when the weather forced a recall, the system had no depth to fall back on. The Germans that day were not beaten by a change of doctrine. They were inconvenienced by one man in one aircraft that happened to have the range to be there. What matters about January 11, 1944, is that it demonstrated, in the most vivid possible way, the shape of the problem. Range was not a convenience. Range was the whole war, and the aircraft Howard was flying that morning was already the answer, sitting in the wrong Air Force, assigned to the wrong role, in numbers far too small, for reasons that had nothing to do with the aircraft's quality. Because while the bombers were being torn apart over Schweinfurt, the three separate solutions that would end the German fighter force were already in existence. None of them had been designed to work together. Two of them were sitting unused or half-used because of institutional decisions made years earlier, and the third had not yet occurred to anyone as a legitimate way to fight. The intellectual failure that produced the disasters of 1943 was not German. It was American, and it had been made in peacetime, in comfortable rooms, by intelligent men. Through the 1930s, the officers who shaped American air doctrine concluded that a fighter capable of escorting a bomber to a strategic target and fighting when it arrived was a technical impossibility. The reasoning was not absurd. To carry that much fuel, the fighter must be larger and heavier. Larger and heavier meant worse performance. Worse performance meant it would be shot down by the smaller interceptors defending the target, which carried no fuel penalty at all. Therefore, the escort fighter would be useless. Therefore, build a better bomber. The flaw in that chain is the assumption that the fuel has to stay attached to the aircraft. External tanks that can be dropped before combat break the argument completely, because the weight penalty exists on the way in and disappears at the moment of contact. This was known. Drop tanks were not a new idea in 1940. They were, however, given very little priority in American fighter development, partly because they pointed toward accepting that the bomber could not defend itself, which was the one conclusion the institution had decided not to reach. The consequence is one of the strangest facts of the war. The aircraft that would break the Luftwaffe was designed and flown in 1940 and was not used as a long-range escort over Germany until December 1943. The historian Paul Kennedy has argued that roughly 19 months were lost, and that part of the reason was institutional resistance inside the American aircraft procurement apparatus to an aircraft that had been built to a British requirement. Other historians regard that emphasis as too personal an explanation and point instead to engine supply priorities and competing production programs. The lost time is not in dispute. The reason for it is. The people who fixed the range problem were not generals and were not aces. One of the central figures was Colonel Cass Huff, a former test pilot running an engineering section in England, whose job was to modify equipment locally when the supply system could not deliver. Huff needed drop tanks in quantity, could not get enough metal ones, and had them made from laminated impregnated paper by a British paper company in London. When technical experts back in the United States assessed the concept and pronounced pressed paper drop tanks absolutely unfeasible, 8th Air Force fighters had already flown with more than 15,000 of them without a structural failure. That is the tone of the entire American solution. It was not visionary. It was improvised, unglamorous, argued over, and assembled out of 3 parts that nobody had planned to combine. The first part was fuel, and it is the least glamorous engineering story of the war. A drop tank is a thin metal or paper shell full of gasoline, hung under the aircraft and thrown away before combat. To be useful, it has to be cheap enough to discard by the tens of thousands. It has to feed reliably at altitude, which requires a pressurized system, and it has to detach cleanly at combat speed without striking the aircraft. Once those problems were solved, the numbers moved fast. Combat radius means the distance a fighter could fly from its base in England, fight, and return. A Thunderbolt carrying no external fuel at all had a radius of roughly 125 miles. With a 75-gallon belly tank, in August 1943, about 230 miles. With the 108-gallon paper tank the following month, about 275 miles, and once the wings were plumbed to carry a tank under each side, by the spring of 1944, around 425 miles. The reach of an existing fighter force more than tripled in under a year, achieved almost entirely by plumbing, with no new aircraft involved at all. The Mustang benefited more than any other type because it burned less fuel to travel the same distance. A P-51B carrying 2 75-gallon tanks had a longer combat radius than a Thunderbolt variant introduced half a year later. That fact is worth stating plainly. The single most important performance figure of the Mustang was not its speed and not its maneuverability. It was fuel consumption. The second part was the aircraft itself, and the Mustang's history is a sequence of near misses. North American Aviation designed it in 1940 against a British purchasing requirement. The airframe was rolled out 102 days after the contract was signed, without an engine fitted, and the prototype first flew on October 26, 1940. The airframe was superb. It had a low drag wing shaped according to laminar flow research and a radiator duct so carefully designed that at some speeds the heated air leaving it produced a measurable amount of thrust. But it was fitted with an Allison engine that had only a single-stage supercharger. Below about 15,000 feet, it was magnificent. Above that, its power fell away, and since the strategic air war was fought between 20,000 and 30,000 feet, the Royal Air Force put it to work at low level, on tactical reconnaissance and ground attack. On April 30, 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker flew one at the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford. Harker's judgment was that the airframe was better than anything he had flown, and that it was being wasted by its engine, and he proposed fitting the 2-stage, 2-speed supercharged Merlin used in the Spitfire 9. Rolls-Royce converted a handful at Hucknall, and the first flew that October. In the United States, North American fitted the Packard-built version of the same engine, and the prototype flew on November 30, 1942. The transformation was not incremental. At 30,000 feet, the Merlin Mustang was around 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison version. It could exceed 440 miles per hour in level flight at altitude, and critically, all of that came with the fuel economy of the original design. There was one more modification, and it is the one that actually put Mustangs over Berlin. An additional fuel tank of 85 gallons was fitted inside the fuselage behind the pilot. It made the aircraft unstable in pitch when full, to the point that pilots were forbidden to maneuver hard until they had burned much of it down, and the standard practice became to take off on the fuselage tank, burn it partially, then switch to the external tanks. It was an inelegant, slightly dangerous solution to a problem of geography, and it worked. The third part was not made of metal at all. On January 6, 1944, Lieutenant General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle was a racing pilot and an aeronautical engineer with a doctorate, and he arrived with no emotional investment in the doctrine that had produced Black Thursday. There is a famous story about what he did next. In the version usually told, Doolittle visited Major General William Kepner at Fighter Command Headquarters, saw a sign stating that the first duty of 8th Air Force fighters was to bring the bombers back alive, and had it replaced with one saying that their first duty was to destroy German fighters. It is a good story and should be treated carefully. Kepner reportedly said the sign was already there when he arrived, no photograph of it has surfaced, and the policy shift had been discussed above Doolittle's level before he took the job. What is not in doubt is the decision itself. The direction had already come down from General Henry Arnold in Washington at the end of 1943, in the form of an instruction that the destruction of the German Air Force was now the priority. What Doolittle did was implement it, and he was in no doubt about its weight. He described it afterwards as the most important and far-reaching military decision he made during the war, and also the most controversial. The decision was this: American fighters would no longer be tied to the bombers. Instead of flying in close formation with the boxes, waiting to react, they would range far ahead and to the sides of the bomber stream, in relays, hunting German fighters wherever they could be found. Bomber crews hated it, because it meant looking up and seeing empty sky. Bomber commanders objected because it appeared to abandon the aircraft they were responsible for. And then Doolittle added the second half, which is the part that killed the Luftwaffe. Fighters that had finished their escort relay and still had fuel and ammunition were to descend on the way home and attack German airfields. Not as a special operation, as routine, every mission, on the way back. Consider what those two instructions do when combined with the range figures. The German system depended on assembling fighters in mass at a chosen point after the escorts had left. Now the escorts did not leave, and American fighters were loitering over the assembly beacons themselves. It depended on getting fighters up through the bomber stream and back down to refuel and rearm. Now the descent, the circuit, and the landing were being attacked. Every stage of it had assumed a safe rear area, and there was no longer a rear area. The result shows up immediately in the arithmetic that mattered most to the men flying the bombers. Across 1943, 8th Air Force heavy bombers were written off at a rate of around 5.1% of every credited sortie flown. Across 1944, with far more missions flown far deeper into Germany, that figure fell to around 1.9%. Now go back to the man in the aircraft with the undercarriage jammed down, and look at his day from the inside. A German fighter pilot defending the Reich in 1944 had a fuel state, and it governed everything. A single-engined German fighter had roughly 60 to 90 minutes of flying time on internal fuel, and far less at combat power. Climbing to 25,000 feet, assembling with other units at a beacon, positioning against a bomber stream, and then fighting consumed most of it. The German interception was not a patrol. It was one engagement with a hard time limit, after which the aircraft had to come down whether or not the battle was over. That was survivable when the return leg was safe, and for 4 years it had been. The pilot broke off, descended, entered the circuit, put the gear down, and landed. During those final minutes, he was slow, low, predictable, committed to a straight approach, frequently out of ammunition, and always with less fuel than he needed to fight again. Every one of those conditions is what a hunting fighter pilot is looking for. The American change of doctrine did not make the Mustang better than the Focke Wulf. It relocated the fight to the part of the sortie in which the outcome did not depend on the aircraft or the pilot at all. A pilot in a landing configuration with empty guns cannot be a good pilot or a bad pilot. He can only be a target. And here are the two theories of air warfare, stated as plainly as they can be stated, because the whole of 1944 sits in the gap between them. The German theory held that air combat is a contest between aircraft and pilots, decided over the objective, and that the correct answer to a bombing offensive is to build a system that concentrates superior force at the point of interception. It was a theory about winning battles. The American theory, after January 1944, held that air combat is a contest of attrition against a supply of trained pilots, decided anywhere at all, and that the location of the fight is a variable to be chosen by the side, with the fuel to choose it. It was not a theory about winning battles. It was a theory about making the other side's battles unaffordable. The Germans were still winning battles in 1944. They won a large one over Leipzig in July. It made no difference whatsoever. The proof of the new theory came in the last week of February 1944, and it was disguised as something else entirely. Operation Argument, which the crews called Big Week, ran from February 20 to February 25, 1944. It was launched on a forecast of clear, cold weather over central Germany. The 8th Air Force put up more than 1,000 heavy bombers and over 800 fighters. The 15th Air Force attacked from Italy, forcing the German defences to face two directions. Royal Air Force Bomber Command struck at night, sending 823 aircraft against Leipzig on the opening night. On paper, the target list was the German aircraft industry, assembly plants, component works, airframe factories. That is how it was briefed, and that is how it is usually described. The cost was real. The 8th lost 97 flying fortresses and 40 liberators during the week, with around 20 more damaged beyond repair. The 15th Air Force, flying from Italy without comparable fighter cover, suffered a loss rate of about 14.6%. And the stated objective failed. German aircraft production did not collapse after Big Week. It rose. Total German aircraft output for 1944 reached 39,807 aircraft, the highest annual figure of the entire war, achieved by dispersing manufacture into hundreds of small sites, simplifying designs, and driving output with forced labor. If you judge Big Week by whether it destroyed the factories, it was a disappointment. But that was never really the point, and the American commanders knew it while it was happening. The bombers were bait. 1,000 heavy bombers sent against the aircraft industry was a target the German fighter force could not decline, because refusing to defend the factories would have been indefensible in Berlin. Every mission compelled the Luftwaffe to launch, and every launch fed pilots into the reach of an escort force that was now released to hunt. That is the reframe on which everything else depends. The Americans stopped measuring the campaign in factories destroyed and started measuring it in German pilots killed. Once you see the campaign that way, the strafing makes sense, and the strafing is the part that has always sat uncomfortably in the histories. On the way home, Mustangs and Thunderbolts came down to a few hundred feet and attacked German airfields directly. Aircraft on the ground, aircraft taxiing, aircraft in the circuit, fuel bowsers, hangars and dispersals. Some pilots reportedly joined the German landing pattern in order to attack aircraft on final approach. This was extraordinarily dangerous work, far more dangerous than air combat, and the reason is light anti-aircraft artillery. A German airfield of 1944 was ringed with 20mm and 37mm guns, firing over open sights. A fighter pilot in a dogfight can see the threat and maneuver against it. A pilot in a strafing run is flying a straight line through a box of pre-aimed fire and can do nothing except hold the line. The figures reflect that. Take the 355th Fighter Group, which destroyed more German aircraft on the ground than any other 8th Air Force group. It lost around 90 aircraft strafing, against 44 in air combat. Across 8th Air Force Fighter Command, the same imbalance holds. Roughly 890 fighters were lost to ground fire while strafing, against around 644 in air combat. Anti-aircraft fire remained the single largest killer of American aircraft in this war. The historian Donald Niebuhr puts the American aircraft shot down over Germany at around 5,380 to flak, 4,274 to fighters, and 2,033 to other causes. The 8th Air Force responded to that risk with a decision that remains argued about 80 years later. It ruled that a German aircraft destroyed on the ground counted the same as one destroyed in the air. The motive was straightforward. Strafing was hated, lethal, and carried no glory, so the command attached the currency fighter pilots actually cared about to the job it needed done. The 9th Air Force did not follow the same rule, which is one reason that comparing individual pilots' scores between American units of this period is close to meaningless. Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley drove the 4th Fighter Group's conversion onto Mustangs at high speed, so it would be ready for the February offensive, on some accounts giving his pilots almost no transition time and telling them to learn the aircraft on operations. The 354th Fighter Group, the first unit to take the Mustang into combat, on December 1, 1943, ended the war with the highest victory total of any American fighter group in Europe at around 701. The 357th Fighter Group, which began Mustang operations in February 1944, finished as the highest-scoring Mustang group in 8th Air Force Fighter Command, with about 595.5 victories in the air and a further 106.5 on the ground. The highest-scoring 8th Air Force group in air-to-air victories was the 56th, which kept its Thunderbolts to the end of the war and was credited with around 677. Now look at what those figures did to the other side, because the German casualty returns from the first half of 1944 are the single most important set of numbers in this story. These figures come from the German loss returns, reconstructed after the war and set out most clearly by the historian Williamson Murray. They describe the single-engined day fighter force defending Germany and occupied Western Europe, and the percentages are of the strength actually on hand, rather than of paper establishment. In January 1944, that force wrote off around 30.3% of its single-engined fighters and lost around 16.9% of its aircrew, killed, wounded, or missing, in 1 month. In February, around 33.8% of the aircraft and around 17.9% of the aircrew. In March, it reached a new peak, at around 56.4% of the fighters and around 21.7% of the aircrew. Then take the fatalities across the first 5 months of the year. Between January and May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 2,262 fighter pilots, against an average fighter pilot strength over that period of approximately 2,283. That is a turnover of very nearly the entire force in 5 months. It is important to state that correctly, because it is often mangled. It does not mean that 99% of the men who began the year were dead by May. It means the number lost in 5 months was almost exactly equal to the number the force held at any one time, which is a different, and in some ways more frightening statement. A unit was being replaced faster than it could accumulate any experience at all. Adolf Galland, who commanded the fighter arm, put it in writing at the time. In a report of 1944, he stated that between January and April, the day fighters had lost over 1,000 pilots, that they included the best squadron, group, and wing commanders, and that the time had come when the weapon was in sight of collapse. At a conference with Hermann Göring in May 1944, he reported that the fighter units defending the Reich had lost around 38% of their pilots during April alone, and that against 489 pilots lost, the training organization had been able to forward 396 replacements. At this point, a reasonable objection arises, and it is the objection the German High Command itself raised. Pilots can be replaced. Every air force loses pilots, and every air force trains more. Germany had a large population, an intact training organization in 1943, and aircraft production that was still climbing. The answer to that objection is the part of the story that finished the Luftwaffe, and it involves two things that had nothing to do with fighter combat. The first is training time, and the trend is brutal. A German fighter pilot entering an operational unit in the period from 1939 to late 1942 arrived with somewhere around 210 to 250 flying hours. By the middle of 1943, that had fallen to roughly 160 to 180 hours. From the middle of 1944 it fell again, to around 110 to 120 hours, of which only about 15 to 20 were on the fighter he would actually fly in combat. The precise figures vary between sources, but every reconstruction shows the same collapse. Set that against his opponent. An American fighter pilot of 1944 typically arrived with around 400 hours, close to half of them on operational types. A Royal Air Force pilot arrived with around 350. The German replacement was being sent to fight men with 3 times his experience, in the most demanding airspace on Earth, in an aircraft he barely knew. The second thing was oil, and it arrived on May 12, 1944, when the 8th Air Force attacked the synthetic fuel plants in central Germany. Albert Speer, who ran German war production, understood immediately what had happened. He later wrote that the 12th of May was the day on which the technological war was decided, and by the end of June he was reporting to Hitler that the enemy had increased German aviation fuel losses by up to 90%. The figures justify the alarm. According to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, German synthetic aviation gasoline production ran at around 175,000 tons in April 1944. By July, it was around 30,000 tons. By September, it was around 5,000 tons. Total synthetic oil output fell from around 316,000 tons a month before the campaign to around 107,000 tons in June and around 17,000 tons in September. Now combine that with the training figures, because this is where the two lines cross and the trap closes. Fuel shortage does not only ground operational units, it grounds the flying schools first, because a training sortie has no immediate military value and is therefore the first thing cut. So the response to catastrophic pilot losses, which is to train more pilots faster, became physically impossible at precisely the moment it became most necessary. The force needed more flying hours per pupil and could afford fewer. That is not a shortage. That is a spiral with no bottom. There is one more piece of evidence, and it is the clearest of all, because it is the Luftwaffe's own attempt to break out of the trap. By November 1944, Galland had assembled a reserve. The plan was called Der große Schlag, the Great Blow. The idea was to hold back fighters until roughly 2,000 could be committed against a single American raid, shoot down 400 to 500 bombers in one day, and inflict a shock severe enough to force a pause in the daylight offensive. It was, in its way, the last coherent expression of the old German theory: concentrate everything at one point and win the decisive battle. It was never carried out as intended. Part of the reason was operational. Assembling 2,000 fighters in the right place at the right time against raids that could go anywhere in Germany was extremely difficult, and it required exactly the safe airspace and the unhurried assembly that no longer existed. Part of the reason was that Galland was overruled. Instead, the reserve was spent on January 1, 1945, in Operation Bodenplatte. Around 1,000 German aircraft went in at low level against 16 or 17 Allied airfields in Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. Tactically, it achieved surprise. Between roughly 250 and 300 Allied aircraft were destroyed, most of them on the ground. The Allies replaced them inside a week. The Germans lost around 271 fighters destroyed and 65 damaged. More importantly, they lost around 143 pilots killed or missing, 70 taken prisoner, and 21 wounded. Among the dead and missing were 3 wing commanders, 5 group commanders, and 14 squadron commanders. In other words, The operation consumed a large part of what remained of the German fighter force's leadership in a single morning. Some of those losses were self-inflicted because the operation was mounted under strict radio silence and German anti-aircraft crews were not warned that 1,000 of their own aircraft would be crossing the front at low level. The scale of that friendly fire is disputed. It has often been claimed that around a third of the losses came from German flak, but the historians who have gone through the individual loss records most carefully argue that this is a myth and that only around 17 aircraft can be confirmed as shot down by German guns. Either way, the conclusion is the same, or it is the conclusion that matters. By January 1945, the German fighter force could no longer mount a major offensive operation without effectively destroying itself in the process. It was not defeated in that battle. It was consumed by the act of fighting it. If this account is giving you something you have not seen elsewhere, a like helps it reach more people, and subscribing means the next one finds you. So here is the verdict, stated as carefully as the evidence allows. The German air defense system did not fail. It was among the most advanced integrated air defense networks in the world when it was built, and the men who ran it kept improving it under conditions that would have broken most organizations. The German fighter aircraft did not fail. Output of them was still climbing when the pilots to fly them had already run out. The German pilots did not fail, and the ones who survived long enough to become experienced remained, individually, among the most dangerous fighter pilots of the conflict. What failed was a theory. The theory held that an air force is defeated by being beaten in the air over the objective it is defending. Both the Germans and, until January 1944, the Americans believed a version of that. The Germans were simply much better at it, and for 18 months they proved it against everyone who came, by day and by night. The Americans did not become better at that contest. They stopped entering it. Their doctrine after January 1944 treated the German fighter force not as an obstacle to be pushed aside over the target, but as a stock of trained men to be spent down wherever it was cheapest to spend them, which turned out to be at the moment of assembly and the moment of landing, rather than the moment of interception. Everything else followed from that single reframing. Honesty requires two qualifications, and they are substantial. The first is that the Mustang did not do this alone, and no serious historian claims it did. It also matters where the German pilots actually died. Most of them were killed in air combat, climbing to intercept, fighting the escort, or being run down on the way home, rather than in the strafing attacks on the airfields themselves. The airfield attacks removed the last place a damaged or empty-handed fighter could recover, and they were an accelerant rather than the principal cause. The larger point stands, which is that the fight had been moved away from the target. The oil campaign that began in May 1944 was doing decisive work at the same time, and Adam Tooze and others have argued that fuel was the binding constraint on the entire German war economy. Anti-aircraft artillery, as Edward Westerman has shown, destroyed more American aircraft than German fighters did, and was far more effective than the post-war official histories were willing to admit. And the Luftwaffe had already been bled badly on the Eastern Front and in the Mediterranean before 1944 began. Williamson Murray's argument in his study of Luftwaffe defeat is precisely that no single front explains it, and that the force was destroyed by simultaneous attrition it could not sustain anywhere. The second qualification is that the German records themselves are imperfect. Loss figures vary between sources. Victory claims on both sides were overstated. The month-by-month pilot loss percentages come mainly from post-war reconstruction of incomplete returns, and different historians present them differently. What survives all of that is the shape of the curve. Whatever the precise figures, the German fighter pilot corps of 1943 was gone by the middle of 1944, and it was replaced by men with a third of the training flying an aircraft they scarcely knew, into airspace where they were being hunted before they had finished climbing. The question worth asking last is why the Germans could not have done the same thing, and the answer is institutional rather than technical. The Luftwaffe never built a strategic reserve of pilots. Galland said so directly after the war. He observed that the German Air Force always fought without reserves, and that this was also the reason it produced pilots with extraordinarily high victory totals. Those two facts are the same fact. A German fighter pilot did not have a tour. There was no fixed number of missions after which he went home. He flew until he was killed, captured, or too badly wounded to continue, and the small number who survived years of that accumulated scores no other air force could match, because no other air force kept its best men at the front indefinitely. The American system did the opposite, and it did it for reasons that were originally about morale rather than about capability. A tour was finite. When a man completed it, he went home, and a large proportion of those men went home to instruct. That single administrative habit turned combat experience into a renewable resource. Every hard lesson learned over Germany was carried back to a training field in Texas or Arizona and taught to 100 replacements who then arrived at their squadrons already knowing it. The German pilot who died in 1944 took what he had learned with him. There is a second institutional difference, and it concerns who was allowed to decide. The German system concentrated authority upward. Galland's proposals were repeatedly overruled by Göring and by Hitler, and production decisions, fuel allocation and the deployment of the fighter reserve were all settled above the level of the men who understood the problem. The American change was made in the opposite direction. Doolittle's decision was fundamentally about delegating. It handed the choice of where and when to fight from the mission planners down to fighter group and squadron leaders in the air, who could see what was actually in front of them. A system that decides at the top can only be as good as its information. A system that decides at the point of contact can exploit an opportunity that nobody at headquarters knew existed, and it is worth saying clearly that nobody designed this outcome. The Mustang was built to a British requirement for a fighter Britain expected to use over France. The Merlin conversion was one test pilot's suggestion. The paper drop tank was a local improvisation to work around a supply shortage. Doolittle's release of the fighters was aimed at reducing bomber losses. Not one of those decisions was taken in order to destroy the German fighter pilot corps. They converged in the same 6 months by something much closer to accident than to design, and the effect of the combination was out of all proportion to any of the parts. Josef Kammhuber, the officer who had built the line that carried his name, survived the war. He had been pushed aside long before the end, moved to a command in Norway in 1943 after arguing with Erhard Milch for a larger and better equipped night fighter force than his superiors were willing to authorize. When the Federal Republic of Germany rebuilt an air force inside the Atlantic Alliance, Kammhuber was appointed its first inspector, its senior serving officer, from 1956 to 1962. There is no irony in that appointment. It was a recognition. The layered structure he had designed in 1940, in which radar coverage is divided into sectors, tracks are passed upward into a central picture, and interceptors are directed onto targets by a controller working from that picture, is not a wartime curiosity. It is the basic architecture of every air defense system that came after it, on both sides of the Cold War, and something very close to it is still running today. Kammhuber's system was never a bad system. It was an excellent solution to the problem of destroying aircraft that come to you. What it could not do, because nobody had thought to ask it to, was protect the aircraft it controlled during the 20 minutes of their sortie when they were of no use to it, climbing out with full tanks or coming home with empty ones. Every Air Force that studied 1944 learned that lesson and built for it afterwards. Hardened shelters at dispersal, airfield anti-aircraft defenses designed against low-level attack rather than against bombers overhead, recovery procedures assuming a hostile circuit. All of it is a direct inheritance from what happened over German airfields in that 1 year, and all of it was designed by people who had read the reports of exactly the kind of afternoon that killed Emil Lang. He was 35 years old. He had flown more than 400 combat missions, most of them in the East, and he had survived the kind of fighting that killed almost everyone who did it. He was not shot down over a target. He was not caught by a better pilot in a better aircraft in a fair fight at altitude. He took off from an airfield outside Brussels on an administrative transfer, could not raise his undercarriage, and was killed 10 minutes later at 200 meters over a Belgian field, in airspace his own air force still believed it controlled. The German theory of air defense was built on a boundary. There was a front, and behind the front there was a rear, and in the rear an aircraft was safe. Every procedure the Luftwaffe used, the assembly at beacons, the single decisive interception, the descent to refuel and rearm and go again, depended on that boundary existing. The American theory after January 1944 contained no such boundary. It held that a German fighter is worth attacking anywhere it can be reached, and that the best place to attack one is wherever it is least able to fight back. Lange's aircraft was not defective in any way that mattered. His skill was not in question. His undercarriage simply would not come up, on the wrong afternoon, in the first year of a war in which there was no longer anywhere behind the lines. If this account was worth your time, the like button and the subscribe button are how it finds the next person who would want it.